What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Fantasy Football Over Analysis. Today we're continuing our series going round by round looking at the best and worst ADPs in the draft. Today we're going to be talking about round 7. And if you watched the round 6 video, you know how bad of a range of the draft that was, how many guys in that range that were just fading altogether. Well, the round 7 guys definitely carry a lot more appeal for me than the majority of players going in round 6. And there's a lot of these guys that I would consider going ahead of ADP on and taking them in round 6 over a lot of those round 6 fades that I had. So in round 7, we have Sam LaPorta, DK Metcalf, Parker Washington, Jordyn Tyson, RJ Harvey, Rhamondre Stevenson, Kyle Pitts, Tony Pollard, Courtland Sutton, Rico Dowdle, Michael Wilson, and Caleb Williams. So at the 701, we have Sam LaPorta of the Detroit Lions, and LaPorta has been a disappointment in each of the last 2 seasons after finishing as the tight end 1 overall in his rookie season. LaPorta, in his second year, finished as the tight end 8, and then last season he finishes as tight end 27. And while I generally don't target the mid-range tight ends, Sam LaPorta could be the one guy that I make an exception for. LaPorta, already part of a great offensive environment in Detroit, now gets an offensive coordinator in Drew Petzing that features tight ends prominently in his offense. Petzing had previously spent the last 3 seasons as the offensive coordinator for the Arizona Cardinals, in which Trey McBride during those 3 years got over 400 targets at the position. So by working with a coordinator that's already running a tight end-centric offense, that's already a boost for LaPorta. Another boost for LaPorta is the absence of David Montgomery, who the Lions traded away in the offseason. And Montgomery, who had over 180 touches last season, his absence now boosts the floors for all of the Detroit skill position players. Those are now 180 opportunities that are going to be spread between guys like LaPorta, Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs. But the absence of Montgomery is especially relevant to LaPorta when it comes to the red zone. Montgomery was one of the primary weapons for the Lions in the red zone, and his absence now frees up 8 touchdowns, so that also unlocks a higher red zone ceiling for LaPorta. And while I don't typically go for tight end after the Elite Four, I do think that LaPorta carries a decent amount of upside that almost puts him into a category of his own. I absolutely have him above guys like Tucker Kraft and Harold Fannin that are going in that round 6 range. That being said, I do still prefer to go for late round tight end options, and also I get my exposure to the Lions typically from Jameson Williams or Amon-Ra St. Brown at the skill position spots, so there's not a lot of team builds that I do where I actually end up with LaPorta, but I do think there's a good case to make for him in this range, and I don't hate it at all if you want to take an earlier tight end, but you can't quite get into the Elite Four. At the 702, we have DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Metcalf has just been a guy that has been a fade for years for me. We have not seen Metcalf hit his ceiling since his sophomore season when he finished as the wide receiver 7. And really, it's just been a steady decline ever since that year. While Metcalf finished as a wide receiver 2 at least in the following 3 seasons, the last 2 years, Metcalf hasn't even been able to crack that top 24 in the wide receiver ranks. And there's just zero path to any kind of ceiling here for Metcalf. This is a guy that hasn't caught more than 66 passes in any of the last 3 years. In the last 2 years, he hasn't even made it to the 1,000-yard mark, and he's not coming anywhere close to double-digit touchdowns either. The fit with Aaron Rodgers has also been a really questionable one. Rodgers at this stage in his career, age 43, can't push the ball down the field like he needs to be able to take full advantage of Metcalf's skill set. So there's just no reason to be taking DK Metcalf at the 702. He's just a bad pick at this point in his career, and it's one that I'm more than happy to let one of my league mates take on. At the 703, we have Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And Washington last year for the Jaguars enjoyed a late season breakout in which he finished the final 4 games of the year, averaging more than double-digit targets per game. This included a great performance against the Buffalo Bills in which he caught 7 passes for over 100 yards and a touchdown. Washington during this stretch of the year showed great chemistry with quarterback Trevor Lawrence, unlike Brian Thomas, who struggled to get on the same page with his quarterback all season long. Washington also works primarily out of the slot. And all the reports coming out of training camp suggest that Parker Washington's breakout from last season is very much going to carry over into this year. So at the 703, Parker Washington is definitely someone that we want to be taking a swing on. He's an ascending young piece on a good offense, and you could even make the case that his ADP should at the very least be a lot closer to Brian Thomas Jr., if not in front of him altogether. And I say that as a guy who believes that Brian Thomas could very much bounce back this season. So Parker Washington at the 703, definitely a guy that I want to be in on, and I would feel completely comfortable taking him over a lot of those guys in that awful round 6 range. At the 704, we have another intriguing young wide receiver pick, Jordyn Tyson of the New Orleans Saints. And there's a lot to like about Jordyn Tyson. First of all, a wide receiver with a first-round draft pick attached to his name, always good bets to make in fantasy. Also, the situation Tyson steps into is going to be a good one. Kellen Moore is a very good play caller, great designer of offense in the NFL. The Saints also figure to be involved in a lot of shootouts, a lot of high-scoring affairs throughout the season. So that all just sets up very nicely for Jordyn Tyson, but you also have the contingent number one receiver upside in the event that Chris Olave, a guy who has really struggled with availability throughout his career, were to go down again. Now, Jordyn Tyson does come with some health concerns of his own, but at cost, drafting him at the top of round 7 as opposed to spending a third-round pick on a Chris Olave, I'd much rather be going after Jordyn Tyson as my exposure to this New Orleans Saints offense than I would spending a premium pick on Chris Olave. Tyson also, like Parker Washington, another guy in this range that I would not mind drafting aggressively in round 6 over some of the less appealing options that are going in that range. Then at the 705, we have RJ Harvey of the Denver Broncos, and Harvey at this price point is going to be a fade for me. And it's just so hard to get excited about RJ Harvey. Harvey was a disappointment as a rookie. We kept waiting all season for him to take over that Denver backfield, and it just never happened. Even when J.K. Dobbins went down for the year with an injury, Harvey was given a chance to be the guy, and he failed his audition. So rather than committing to Harvey as the guy this offseason, Denver goes out and they bring back J.K. Dobbins on a new 2-year deal, and they go out and draft Jonah Coleman in the 3rd round of the draft this year. And everything in this backfield just tells you to stay away from it from a fantasy perspective. It's going to be the frustrating committee all season long. Everybody's going to have a role. Everybody's going to play a little bit, but nobody's going to play enough to the point where you feel good about plugging them in, even as a flex play in your lineup. The best case scenario that you can hope for with RJ Harvey is that he opens up the season with the 3rd down role, the passing downs locked up for himself, and then you hope that Dobbins goes down with another injury at some point, and it opens the door once again for him to get a larger role. But in the 7th round, it's still too high of a price for me to pay for him. If he were to drop a couple more rounds by the end of summer, then I might have some interest in Harvey if the stock gets so low, but we're not at that point yet. At the 706, we have Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. And Stevenson is a guy that a lot of fantasy managers hope just goes away at some point this season so that we can finally see the Travion Henderson breakout. I don't know that that's going to be the case. Henderson is still struggling in pass protection, and meanwhile, Rhamondre, despite his fumbling issues, has the complete trust of Mike Vrabel and the coaching staff. And I actually don't hate the situation that Stevenson is going to be in for this season. I think it's going to be something like a 60% snap share in favor of Rhamondre Stevenson, where he's going to get a lot of the early down work, he's going to be the primary option on the goal line, and because he can hold up in pass protection over Henderson, he's also going to have access to more passing targets in the receiving game as well. The problem with Rhamondre, though, is even though he might have more opportunity than Travion Henderson, his ceiling is also very much capped. I think he's not going to finish as anything better than what he's been the last couple of years, which is a low-end RB2, high-end RB3 type. And in the middle of round 7, I think that's a high price tag to pay for a guy that only has floor and not a lot of ceiling to offer you. I'd be fine with Stevenson as my RB4 if I were to get him a couple rounds later than this, but in the 7th round itself, that's too early for me to be going after a guy that I think has really limited upside. And here we go, guys, at the 707. This is a big one. Tight end Kyle Pitts. And I'm going to say the same thing that I said in the video on the Atlanta Falcons. Just say no to Kyle Pitts. It really is just impressive to me that the fantasy community continues to do this with Kyle Pitts just year after year, overhyping and overdrafting the guy left and right. And yes, Kyle Pitts does last season finish as the tight end too, but that's just so much more an indictment of how bad the tight end position was last year for fantasy football. And for Pitts, it all comes down to this. The majority of his production came in that one silly game on the Thursday night against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where Tampa just was not interested in playing any kind of defense whatsoever. They let Pitts run wild, catching 11 passes for 166 yards and 3 touchdowns. But that's where the majority of the Pitts production came from last year. The rest of the season, it was awful. The rest of the season, Kyle Pitts had exactly 4 games in which he reaches the 15-point mark in full PPR. He also has only 2 other games the entire season, that's 2, where he scores any touchdowns. Pitts also had 8 games, that would be about half the fantasy season, where he scored less than 10 points. So this Kyle Pitts thing is just absolutely amazing to me. You have a guy who spends the majority of the season just being a complete nothing, a black hole in your fantasy lineup. He has the one outlier performance, and that's enough for everybody to buy back in, overdraft him again, say that the breakout has finally happened, Kyle Pitts is here to stay. Also of note of the outlier game, this came when Drake London was out of the lineup, and the Falcons literally had nowhere else to go with their passing game. Kyle Pitts has just never been able to separate himself as even the third best target on this team when Drake London is healthy. So if you guys want to buy back in again on Kyle Pitts, you do you. I'm going to have none of it. I would much rather be taking the late round tight end options, and it's not even close. If I had to take a mid round tight end, it would be Sam LaPorta. Kyle Pitts is somebody that it's going to be a grenade that somebody else can fall on. Coming in at the 708, we have Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. And Tony Pollard is someone that we would like a lot more if he wasn't stuck in such an awful situation in Tennessee. Pollard has just barely been startable over the last 2 years. He's finished as a back-end RB2 both seasons in Tennessee, rushing for just over 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns in each of the first 2 years. Honestly, really identical outputs in both seasons for him. And I think with Pollard, there's not really a lot to be excited about here. You know what you're getting with him. You're getting a back-end RB2. You're getting a high-end RB3 that's going to struggle to get to 10 to 12 fantasy points, but he's not going to be a 0 in your lineup either. But this is the dead zone running back range, so this is exactly the kind of output you expect from guys in situations like that. Now, I will say the one thing with Pollard is to keep an eye on how things stand with him as we get to the trade deadline. Pollard is on the last year of his deal with the Titans, and if a contender is in need of a starting caliber running back, at that point, he's absolutely a guy that could be in the conversation to get moved into a much better situation. But we can't live in a world where we're projecting trades at this range of the draft. So Tony Pollard in this range, another dead zone running back that I'm just going to be fading. It's too expensive of a price point for a guy that's really only going to cap out as a low-end RB2, high-end RB3. At the 709, we have Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Sutton, a guy that has offered really steady fantasy production over the last 2 years, catching at least 75 passes for over 1,000 yards and between 7 and 8 touchdowns. He's a very reliable, very high-floor guy that's attached to a good offense in Denver. Now, the Broncos do go out and add Jalen Waddle in the offseason, which obviously is going to cut into Sutton's upside a little bit. Sutton no longer the clear alpha receiver there. Also, now that Sutton's on the wrong side of 30, the Broncos could try to manage his workload a lot more throughout the season in order to keep him fresh and effective for the playoffs, which is when they really need a guy like him. The end result is a discount on Sutton. He can be had at a much cheaper price point than what you've had to go and get him at in previous seasons. However, this also comes in a range where we have wide receivers like Jordyn Tyson, Parker Washington, and Michael Wilson, who we'll get into in a minute, that are all younger and have much greater upsides at this point than Sutton. Sutton is a guy that I would still feel good about rolling out into your lineup as a wide receiver 3 or a flex play on any given week. But plain and simple, I just can't draft him over some of the younger guys going in this range. Next up, we have Rico Dowdle of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Dowdle now on his third team in 3 years. He's coming off of back-to-back seasons in which he's ran for at least 1,300 yards. He also enters a situation where he's familiar with head coach Mike McCarthy from their time together in Dallas. And Dowdle, who was looking for an opportunity to be a number 1 running back once again, is going to be in a situation where he's competing with Jaylen Warren for touches out of this backfield. The early reports out of training camp have been favorable for Dowdle, but even if he comes away with the early down work, then Jaylen Warren is still going to be tough to beat out for the 2-minute drill and passing down work, meaning that Dowdle is going to leave you with very limited reception upside. And while Dowdle really isn't a terrible bet to make as the RB32 right now in drafts, in this range, I just like the wide receivers that are on the board better. I also like Caleb Williams at the end of this round over a guy like Dowdle. If I'm looking for a later round running back to go after, I'd be going after Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt or Jonathan Brooks several rounds later in the draft before I go for Dowdle in round 7. Coming in at the 7-11, we have Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. Wilson was one of the guys that benefited the most from the quarterback change from Kyler Murray to Jacoby Brissett. Wilson was a must-start guy towards the end of the year last year, averaging over double-digit targets per game, and he finishes as the wide receiver 10 overall. Now, this year, the great news is Jacoby Brissett's back, and he's got his contract figured out, so he'll be the guy under center from week 1. The bad news, again, like we've talked about before for these Arizona skill position guys, is that it's very unlikely that they're going to make it the whole season with Jacoby Brissett as the starter. At some point, they're going to turn it over to Carson Beck. And while Beck did have that nice showing in the Hall of Fame game, it remains to be seen whether or not he can support these Arizona pass catchers. I will say, though, for Michael Wilson, that I think the breakout was real last year. Wilson showed me a lot more in that last stretch of the season than I had seen from Marvin Harrison Jr. in 2 years, and you're still paying a 6th-round pick to get Marvin Harrison, whereas you can get Michael Wilson almost in the 8th round at this point. I think at the 7-11, Wilson's perfectly fine to take a swing on at this point in the draft. I don't think he's going to quite reach the wide receiver 10 levels that he reached a year ago, but I think a wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 finish is still well within his range of outcomes. And for the final pick in this round, you have Caleb Williams, quarterback for the Chicago Bears. Williams right now being drafted as the QB7 overall, and this is the point where I myself start to have serious interest in the quarterback position. And Caleb Williams, to me, is a really special case. This is a guy that I think is still growing, still developing, still finding his way in Ben Johnson's offense. Last season, while he made such improvements in his game, there was still a lot that he could improve on. And if he takes that step forward again in his 3rd season, then you're talking about a guy that has QB1 overall within his range of outcomes. So Caleb Williams last season finishes as the QB5 overall. He does it by throwing for just under 4,000 yards and 27 touchdowns, and then he adds another 480 yards and 3 scores on the ground. So just looking at those numbers on both the rushing and passing end of things, there's multiple pathways here that Caleb could take to reaching an even higher finish at the quarterback position. With the weapons that Caleb Williams has to work with in this offense, it's well within his range of outcomes that he could produce a 4,500-yard passing season with 35 to 40 touchdowns. He could also spike with his rushing as well. Imagine if Caleb were to have a season like what Trevor Lawrence had a year ago for the Jaguars, where Lawrence ran in 9 touchdowns. If Williams were to have a spiked year with rushing touchdowns, that too would also provide him a major boost. And again, you also have to factor in the continued growth that's going to happen in year 2 of Ben Johnson. So I look at Caleb Williams coming in as the QB7 right now, and I think he's honestly being drafted maybe a little bit below his floor, which I think is as a top 5 quarterback. And I think the ceiling is there for him to get into the top 3, if not QB1 overall. So at the bottom of round 7, I just think that Williams is an absolutely fantastic pick. And he's another guy that's in this range that I wouldn't even mind going into round 6 to go get when you weigh it against the horrible options that we went over that are currently being drafted in the 6th round. And that's going to do it for this one, guys. So the 7th round is a lot more appealing than what we had going on in round 6. There's just so much upside in this range. You have Caleb Williams going at the bottom of this round. You have really good young receivers like Parker Washington, Jordyn Tyson, Michael Wilson that I all want to have some kind of exposure to. And the best part of this range is that using what we know about round 6, knowing that there are just a lot of landmines, a lot of fades in that range, then we're going to take advantage of our draft pick in round 6 and get one of these guys in round 7 and then come away with a second one when we get back on the clock in round 7. So essentially, we're going to come away from most of our drafts with 2 of these guys that are going in this range. And so while I have Caleb Williams, Jordyn Tyson, Parker Washington, Michael Wilson as the best picks that you can make in this round, I also don't hate Sam LaPorta either if you decide that you want to go for one of the mid-range tight ends. And really, the only guys that I think are outright fades for me at this point is the dead zone running back tier that's lurking in this range, the RJ Harvey, Tony Pollard, Rico Dowdle types, and Kyle Pitts as well. One of the biggest fades that I have in the entire draft also goes in this range. We don't need to touch that at all. But again, I thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please consider liking and subscribing, and we'll talk to you next time when we go over the guys in round 8.